22. 10 months later. As she walked down the hallway to Solly's office, she could hear two men laughing and talking through the half-open door. No noisy, open office environment, this. Solly had enough pull to set himself up with an interdisciplinary gig, endowment-funded, not tied to any one department. He hung out in an old pseudo-Gothic building on the Princeton campus, within striking distance of both neuroscientists and computer geeks. His office looked out over one of the campus's many green quadrangles. It was big, book-lined, and quiet. She pushed at the open door and found Solly sitting there chatting with Corvallis Kawasaki and Enoch Root, both of whom had joined via video conference on a flat-panel screen. This kind of thing was getting a little antiquated, but people still used it. "Hi, Sophia," called C+, when he saw her entering the frame. "Am I late?" "You're early," said Solly. He was a tiny guy, deeply embedded in a leather chair like a mouse in a baseball mitt. "Okay, phew." "We hopped on a little early," C+ explained. "We had some other things to talk about." "In Latin?" There was an awkward pause, and then they all laughed. "I am sorry you heard my butchered Latin," C+ said. "How embarrassing." "I wouldn't know butchered from non-butchered," Sophia said. "But why?" "It's a running gag between me and Enoch," C+ explained. "He walked up to me once in a bar near the Foundation and hailed me in conversational Latin." "Because he knew you spoke it," Sophia guessed. "Because of the Roman legion stuff you do." "Yes. It made quite an impression on all of the Amazon employees hanging out there." "And on you," Enoch said. His face was sharing the screen with a pint of amber fluid topped with foam. "I didn't know Enoch at the time, so yes, it came as quite a surprise," C+ admitted. "Anyway, we practice our Latin sometimes. His is much better than mine." "Hi, Enoch," said Sophia. "Where are you?" Enoch reached out with the hand that wasn't holding the beer and moved the camera around, giving them a blurred panorama of what seemed to be a very charming pub. "England?" Sophia guessed. "Ireland?" "No," Enoch answered. "The independent sovereign nation of—" "Wait for it." With utmost gravity he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a passport. He held it up to the camera. It looked newly minted. Embossed in gold letters on the front, it claimed, in French, Dutch, and English, to be an official document from Zelric Alberg. "You're printing passports now?" C+ exclaimed. "It's just a piece of paper," Enoch said with a shrug. "You know L. He is fascinated by nation-states, always hacking the system." "Well, speaking of hacking the system," Solly said, "I think we are all here." He was referring, as everyone knew, to Sophia's thesis committee. This was a big and strangely diverse committee for a mere senior thesis, but it had all got a bit complicated, and so there were reasons why all three of these men were in on it. "Yes, let's go," said C+. Enoch signaled his assent by raising his pint and nodding. "You've been busy," said Solly, swiveling his chair to face Sophia. Sophia sighed. "I'm glad you see it that way." "Why wouldn't I?" "My classes, my grades, those are formalities that the university has set up to make sure students don't go off the rails because of inattention or laziness or whatever." "A safety net?" He laughed. "A safety net for the university, a danger net for the student. As the one person in this meeting who is supposed to be paying attention to such things, let me say that I see you as having cleared all of those hurdles a year ago. Your senior year has effectively been graduate school. That's how I can say with confidence that you've been busy, because I hear about your efforts from Corvallis, from Enoch, and from my graduate students and my postdocs." "My efforts," Sophia snorted. "Mostly asking them questions." "That is as good a metric of effort as any. Better than tests and grades, certainly." "I'm glad you see it that way. The grades I have received during the last year are the worst of my life." "The only thing that matters is whether you can clear the bureaucratic hurdles required to graduate," Solly pointed out. "No one gives a shit about your grades, Sophia. No one will ever look at them again." She looked at the screen. Both Enoch and C+ had politely averted their gazes. That's kind of mind-blowing, she said. Because you've spent your whole life on the academic treadmill. Now you're stepping off of it. What matters from here on out is your work, your holograph. In the non-3D graphics sense of that word. She shrugged. Okay, should we talk about that? Yes. This is your so-called capstone project, or keystone, whatever you want to call it. Solly glanced out the window of his office for a moment, trying to access the relevant memory from the tiny compartment of his brain where he kept track of administrative minutiae. I believe senior thesis is the term they'll be looking for, Sophia ventured, since Solly appeared to be looking in the direction of the dean's office. Very well. You incubated it last summer, during your internship in Seattle. Solly glanced at the screen, eliciting a nod of confirmation from C+. That's a nice way of saying it. What really happened was that I got in way over my head there. I had no idea what a big deal it was, how long it would take. I barely even got started before I had to come back here. You incubated it last summer, Solly repeated, raising his hands to make air quotes, and glancing again toward the dean's office. Building on the foundation of knowledge and the code base that you established during those months, you returned to Princeton in the fall with a clear understanding of how to move forward. Again he looked at the screen. C+ and Enoch were both poker-faced. No objections. Yes, absolutely. Whatever. Solly nodded toward the pad of paper that was sitting on the table in front of Sophia, and paused for a few moments while she jotted this down. He'd been speaking toward the screen, perhaps worried his voice wasn't coming through, but now dropped into his usual relaxed tone. I have looked through DB myself a few times, and I know it's an Augean stables. Ah, thank you, Solly. Huh? C+ asked. We Dolores fans have to stick together, Solly explained, and winked at Sophia. For the two of them had long ago bonded over their shared love of those books. Anyway, Dodge's brain. My God, all of those different data formats at war with each other, each of them encoding someone's pet theory as to how the brain works. It's no surprise you spent the whole summer just getting oriented. The only thing that matters is that the Forthrast Family Foundation didn't give you the sack. You came back, you were able to do some new things here in this department. Now tell me in your own words what you did, and we'll bang it into a form that is acceptable as a senior thesis, which, and he checked his watch, is due in a week. I know. Sophia threw her head back in embarrassment. I just don't know where to begin. Dear Mom, suggested Solly. Huh? That's how to begin. Solly made a sort of exaggerated pointing gesture, apparently trying to draw her attention to the pad of paper. Dear Mom, write that down. She wrote it down. I've been working on digitally stimulating my great-uncle's brain, Solly continued. I've been working, she muttered, writing as fast as she could. Brain. Then she looked up expectantly. Solly shrugged. I have no idea what to say next. You know your mother and your project better than I do. She wrote a sentence. Now we're cooking, C+ said. I like this plan. Read it back to us. When I got back to Princeton in September, thanks to all the help from C+, I felt like I knew my way around DB pretty well, she read. Flattery will get you everywhere, Corvallis said. Tell you what, Solly said, manipulating some kind of UI. Why don't you dictate it? Saves time. I just turned on voice capture. The connectome was a Tower of Babel, Sophia began, speaking slowly at first, then warming to the task. The same basic set of connections, interpreted and expressed in dozens of different ways. In order to even get started, I had to write code that would walk through all of those files and spit out a connectome that I could at least work with. During the summer, I'd laid a lot of the groundwork, but the code was slow and buggy. I cleaned it up and got it to run faster. By Thanksgiving break, I had something I could use. Use how? Solly asked. I just mean that it was compatible with the neural simulation algorithms that I had access to here at Princeton. Until then, it had been a total square-peg, round-hole problem. But by Thanksgiving, you were in a position to get the peg into the hole. Yeah, so then I fired it up on a small scale during December, meaning I got the simulation algorithms to run on a tiny subset of the connectome. Proof of concept by Christmas, very good. Okay, that's what I'll call it, proof of concept. She jotted that down. Then I spent winter break feeling kind of depressed about the whole thing. No one gives a shit about your feelings, Enoch pointed out, in a cheerful way, not being mean at all. Wry humor. Sophia accepted it in the same spirit but pushed back a little. Right, but there was a technical basis for those personal feelings. Which was? C+ asked. I couldn't think of any intermediate steps to take next. It makes sense to simulate one neuron. 2 neurons talking to each other, fine. Beyond that, it's a network. Network effects are all that matter. Simulating, say, 1,000 neurons doesn't break any new ground. People have been doing that for decades. The fact that the connectome of those 1,000 neurons was arbitrarily cut and pasted from DB is completely meaningless. It might as well have come from a mouse brain. Agreed, Solly said. The only meaningful next step was to light up the whole connectome at once. Really? Then why had no one done this before? Well, for one thing, the data has been lacking. A full connectome of a human brain has only come into existence in the last couple of years. Then there's the lack of resources. Who would pay for all the computing power required? So it was inconceivable until Hole in the Wall came online. That's good, Solly said. Maybe you are being diplomatic by leaving out another factor, which is the academic mindset. Academic science advances in many micro steps, one paper at a time. Peer-reviewed papers are the way we keep score. The more papers, the better. If you can take a project and slice it fine like prosciutto, you publish more papers and your score goes up. But you were behaving like someone who didn't know or care about that. Sophia blushed. Maybe I'm naive, okay. You're rich, Enoch announced. I beg your pardon? You're rich, he repeated. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a criticism. How does that enter into it? 2 ways. First, you simply don't care about playing the game, publishing as many papers as possible, Enoch explained with a nod at Solly. Second, you had access to the resources needed. There was a long silence, during which it seemed entirely possible that Sophia might start crying. Listen, Enoch said, there is a long and honorable history dating back to the Royal Society of the Gentleman Scientist, and now the Lady Scientist. We don't like to acknowledge it because we wish to maintain a polite facade of egalitarianism, but there's a reason why so many important theorems are named after members of the titled nobility of Europe. Sophia didn't answer, but she seemed to be settling down a bit. You don't have to put Enoch's observations into your thesis, of course, Solly said. But you should be prepared for people to ask the question. If that happens, she said, I may not have satisfactory answers. How so? I still don't really know where the money came from. She said it loudly, with a sidelong glance at the screen. An anonymous donation, Enoch said. Happens all the time. Is that how I should say it, in my thesis? Be as brief as possible, Sophia, I beg of you, Solly said. It gives me a headache trying to sort out the Forthrasts and the Waterhouses and the Shepherds and all their interlocking bits. It's like binge-watching a Mexican soap opera. Well, Sophia said, between you and me, Solly shut off the recording. Over Christmas, I spent a little time with my Uncle Jake and his family. He asked me what I was up to, and I told him. By the time I got back to Princeton after the break, you had an account at Hole in the Wall, Solly said. Yes. Set up in your name by a mysterious benefactor. Yes. And when I logged on to it, I was able to see the available balance, the amount of money I had to spend. It was a pretty impressive number. She looked at Enoch's face on the screen, but he seemed to be preoccupied by something in the charming pub. perhaps an engaging barmaid, perhaps a soccer game on the television. "We'll clean this up verbally," Solly mentioned.
"I beg your pardon?"
"I'll help you tidy up the language so that it better befits a Princeton senior thesis."
"Right. Thank you."
She knew what he really meant. She'd better tidy it up herself than run it by him.
"Anyway, there was enough money in the account that I was able to transfer all of the files from our servers here, where they'd been living, to local storage at Hole in the Wall."
"Much faster," C+ translated. "A more solid platform on which to base further work."
"Yes," Sophia agreed, jotting this down. "Then there was a couple of months of tweaking the code and the algorithms to run on their devices."
"We originally wrote the code to run on conventional computers," Solly said, translating this. "Quantum computers require different strategies, different optimization."
"That's very much a work in progress, by the way."
"Of course. Fuck's sake, Sophie, it's just a senior thesis. A simple but workable port is all any sane person would expect."
"Well, that's what I did. The bare minimum that would run. With a lot of help from your postdocs."
"Who will, of course, be copiously acknowledged."
"That's the only part of the thesis that's actually written," she replied, beaming. "The acts."
"So, now we are up to what?"
"Mid-April.
About a month ago. You got it running."
"I got a neural simulation running on the hole-in-the-wall system with one neuron. Then two, with the neurons passing messages back and forth."
"With each being a separate, independent process. That's important to mention."
"Right. And everything bolted down nice and proper. The messages all being transmitted through modern cloud protocols, suitably encrypted and verified," C+ reminded her. "Of course, so that it would scale."
"Very good. And then?"
"Then I scaled it."
"You flipped the switch."
"Yeah."
"The big red-handled blade switch on the wall of the mad scientist lab."
Getting into the spirit, she said, "Yeah, I hooked the jumper cables up to the neck bolts."
"You turned on the whole DB at once," Solly said, "and the lights dimmed in Ephrata or something."
"Maybe. I'm not so sure about the lights dimming."
"What happened then?"
"Little wiggles."
I'm afraid you'll have to do better, Sophia."
"Okay. An oscillatory phenomenon?" "What precisely was oscillating?" C+ asked. "The burn rate."
"That is a Silicon Valley term that might not go over well in a senior thesis, young lady,"
Solly said, mock serious, but serious. She looked sheepish and drew breath a few times as if about to speak. Each time she thought better of it. "Dear Mom," Enoch prompted her, and took a swig of beer. "Yes," she said. "See, Mom, the thing is, it's one thing to simulate a brain. It's another thing to talk about it. We forget this because our brains are hooked up to bodies with handy peripherals like tongues that can speak and fingers that can type. As long as those work, you can always get some idea of what's going on in a brain. But a brain in a box doesn't have those, which is probably another reason that no one has tried this yet."
"Namely that there's no point in doing it if you can't get meaningful information out."
"Yes, it's like hooking an EEG up to a patient in a coma," Sophia said.
"That is a useful analogy."
"The EEG is a legit scientific instrument. It's definitely telling you something about brain activity, no question about it. But you can stand there all day looking at the strip of paper coming out of the EEG, staring at the wiggles, and still not have the faintest idea whether anything useful is actually going on inside of that brain, whether the person is conscious, what they're thinking." "And here the EEG is an analogy for what exactly?" C+ asked. He knew, of course, he was prompting her. "The burn rate, the cost, the monetary cost of running the simulation. When a lot of neurons are engaged and a lot of signals are being passed over the connectome, the quantum processors at Hole in the Wall are busy, and so the system charges us more money and draws it down from the account. I can log on and watch the balance in the account declining. Sometimes it declines fast, sometimes slow. If I draw a graph of the burn rate, it looks like this." She peeled the top sheet off the pad to expose a new page and slashed out a long horizontal axis that presumably represented time. A shorter vertical axis was burn rate. Starting at their origin, she began to draw a line across the page, wiggling the pen randomly up and down. At first, a lot of what looks like noise. Activity comes and goes in surges. I tried running some statistical packages against it, but it's pretty close to just chaos. But then later, we start to see some periodicity emerge. She began ticking the pen up, down, in a steady rhythm. Like a heartbeat, just for a little while, then back to random. More pen shaking. She was approaching the edge of the paper. Just within the past week, though, it really settled down. She slowed the pen's progress and marked out a neat, regular series of ramps, each ramp ending with a sudden drop toward 0. The last of them went off the page. Having run out of paper, she flipped the pad around and held it up so that Enoch and C+ could see her handiwork. And that's where we are now, she concluded, as of an hour ago. Like it's stuck in some kind of repetitive cycle, C+ said. That's my takeaway from your graph. That's what worries me, she said. Or maybe it's waking up, building to some level of activity, and then going to sleep again. I would not recommend putting that kind of anthropomorphic language into your thesis, Solly said. Of course. A very basic question. Can the connectome self-modify? Enoch asked. Self-modification is a vast, separate thing from what I'm trying to do at this stage, Sophia exclaimed. She glanced at Solly and C+, and read in their faces that they were both as taken aback as she was by Enoch's question. Oh, it was a fascinating topic to think about, but way out of scope for this project. Dear Mom, Enoch repeated. Okay. Mom, keep in mind, there's a huge difference between this simulation and a real brain. A real brain is a Heraclitean fire, never the same brain twice. You can take a snapshot of the connectome at the moment of death, which is what we have done here in the case of DB, but that bears the same relationship to a real brain as a freeze frame does to a movie. In a real brain, every single time a neuron fires, the brain rewires itself a little bit in response to that event. Frequently used connections get strengthened. Neglected ones atrophy. Neurons get repurposed. Things get remembered or forgotten. And none of that is happening in my simulation. Why not? Solly asked. He knew the answer perfectly well, but was still acting as devil's advocate, also helping to shield her a bit from Enoch's weird and transgressive line of questioning. Well, first of all, because I didn't feel like I was ready. I had to get it running first, to see what happened, whether it would work at all. Secondly, because it's more expensive. It would consume more memory, more processing power, and I was afraid of running out. The algorithms you are using have the self-modification capability built in, Enoch pointed out. Unless you went to the trouble of ripping it out. No, I didn't rip it out, I just turned it off. Suppressed it for now. I don't think anyone here is arguing with that decision, Solly said, with a sort of quizzical glance at Enoch. You're right that you had to simply get it running first, to see what would happen, and no one will blame you for being conservative with your expenditure of resources. Enoch said, But it's hardly surprising, is it, that you're seeing repetitive, cyclic behavior, that it's stuck in some kind of loop? Freeze-framed, Sophia said. Can I see it? Solly asked. Can you log on for me? I'm just curious to see what this all looks like. You've piqued my curiosity. Absolutely. It's a pretty simple old-school interface. Can we use that? She indicated an empty space on the wall of his office and slipped her glasses on. That's what it's there for, Solly said. He got up, went over to his desk, and found a wearable rig half buried in clutter. By the time he had put it on and booted it up, Sophia had placed a virtual screen on his wall and was logging into her hole-in-the-wall account. This was disconcertingly old school, looking like a circa 1995 web page, enlivened with a background photo of the eponymous Cooley. Meanwhile, in another window, she was booting up the program she'd been using to plot and analyze the burn rate data. The first thing that came up was a graph, looking generally similar to the one she'd just drawn on the paper, but with more noise and complexity. The sawtooth wave pattern was clearly discernible. "Can you give me a plot of the integral of this?" Solly asked. "The balance in the account versus time?" "Sure." Sophia typed in a command, fixed an error, did a bit of tidying up, and produced a new plot. This one was a ramp, starting at a high value back in February and declining to a lower one today. Sometimes it declined steeply, other times it leveled off, following a pattern that tallied with the burn rate graph. "That's all I needed to see," Solly said. "In 4 months you have burned through about 3/4 of the funds you were given by your mysterious benefactor as a Christmas or Hanukkah present." He glanced toward Enoch. "You have a week remaining before you absolutely need to turn your thesis in. If you keep the simulation running as is, you'll finish out that week with a lot of unspent money in the account. But you won't see anything new during that week." "Agreed. It's stuck." "So my recommendation is you turn on the self-modification capability," Solly said. That silenced Sophia for a few moments. She hadn't seen it coming. It was the kind of thing Enoch might have suggested, not Solly. "Look, I'm dying to," Sophia admitted, after she'd got her equilibrium back. "But it's kind of, I don't know, non-scientific, right? I don't understand this yet. Now I'm going to go ahead and make it infinitely more complicated." "Science begins with gathering data," Solly said. "All scientists wish that the data were better. Don't let that stop you." "I don't want to come off as presumptuous." "As an undergraduate in your last week," Solly said, "this is the last time in your life you'll be able to get away with being presumptuous. I recommend you make the most of it." Those guys are up to something. The awareness came to her slowly over the next few days, not as a flash of insight or a flood of waters, but like groundwater rising below the foundation of a home. There were various hints and traces that, taken alone, might have been ignored or explained away. But the one detail that clinched it had been the look on C+'s face and the tone of his voice at the very moment that Sophia had walked through the door into Solly's office. Had C+ actually been there in Princeton, it might have been different. He might have heard her footsteps approaching, might have seen the door beginning to move. Fast as thought, the muscles of his face would have adjusted. But the latency of the network had given her a head start. Solly's connection was as good as tech could make it. But tech couldn't do anything about the speed of light. It took time for the image of Sophia's entering the room to make its way to wherever C+ was, and for his reaction to make its way back. And during that interval, as she stood in the doorway looking at the big screen, she was like a ghost. Not the ghost of Christmas past, more the other way around. It was she who was in the present, seeing C+ and Enoch as they had been in the past, the moment before she entered. And what she saw there, at thrice life-size on a big high-resolution display, was Corvallis Kawasaki looking a way she had never seen him before. He looked like a little kid. The expression, "kid in a candy store," didn't quite capture it. She had heard secondhand from her mother an anecdote about how John and Dodge had, at the ages of something like 10 and 8, figured out how to pick the lock on the bomb shelter that their father had built beneath the backyard of the house in Iowa during the darkest and scariest time of the Cold War, and how they had gone in there with flashlights and discovered things that fascinated and terrified them. Guns and ammunition and K-rations, yes, but also trophies of war that their father had looted from the corpses of Nazis, pictures he had taken while liberating concentration camps, stashes of European pornography, vials of morphine, ancient bottles of Bordeaux and cognac, correspondence from ladies who were not his wife. Dodge and John had very carefully backed out of that bomb shelter and closed the door and locked it, and never divulged to their father that they had gone in, and after the patriarch had passed away, they had destroyed most of what was down there. The look on the face of Corvallis Kawasaki during the moment that it took for the bits to reach him, for him to react to Sophia's being in the room, and for new bits to come back and refresh the screen, was very much like what she imagined John and Dodge had looked like
as they shone their flashlights around their father's bomb shelter. Partly it was a childish unguardedness that she'd only seen on his face at Dodge's funeral and at his and Maeve's wedding at the moment she had come up the aisle. But added to that was fascination. She could tell something ineffable about the postures and expressions of Solly, Enoch, and C+ told her that they had been on the call for a while, that they had scheduled it for well before the start time that they had divulged to her, and that much she was able to confirm later simply by looking at Solly's calendar, which she and other students had access to. They'd been on for a whole hour before Sophia had been told to show up, and they'd been talking about stuff that had put C+ in a very unusual frame of mind indeed, and they'd been talking about it in Latin. At another time in her life, she would not have been able to get it out of her mind. She'd have gone into Nancy Drew mode. As it was, she had a senior project to finish and a presentation to make, so she reluctantly filed it away as a matter she would have to ask C+ about the next time they were together. And so a week later, Sophia presented, addressing Solly and 2 other faculty members. This time C+ and Enoch were absent. For the purpose of this presentation was to get the university to sign off, and those 2 didn't work for the university. They met in an old room lined with wood paneling and bookshelves. Above the head of the table was a stretch of wall that showed signs of having been used for many different purposes over the centuries. A portrait of a great man must have hung there for at least 100 years. Then a pull-down screen had been installed in the ceiling for slideshows and overhead projectors. That had been supplanted by at least 2 generations of flat-panel monitors and multiple rewiring jobs. They'd probably got the cabling perfect just in time for everything to go wireless. Within the last few years, they'd finally carted the last monitor off to the junkyard and sealed the useless cables up inside the walls. Now it was just an expanse of wood paneling, featureless, except for the fine, subtle patterning of the grain. Everyone present had wearables of one kind or another that would project shared hallucinations onto that surface. Since most of the presentation consisted of Sophia's talking, they didn't actually use that capability until the very end, when a shift in posture and a tone of voice sent the message that it was all over and that Sophia had cleared the hurdle. From here on out, it was just chit-chat. Intelligent people expressing curiosity about this or that. One of them voiced interest in seeing the data plots. Sophia brought them up on the virtual screen, just as she had a week earlier in Solly's office. The burn rate plot mostly looked the same, up to the point a few days ago when Sophia had turned on the ability of the connectome to self-modify. The results were immediate and obvious. Burn rate shot up. The repetitive sawtooth wave pattern vanished and was replaced by something more chaotic, but with just enough structure to draw the viewer's attention and beguile them into thinking that there was some structure to it. "Let me just refresh the data so they're fully up to date," Sophia muttered, and invoked a menu item. A message flashed up informing them that it was downloading information from Hole in the Wall and there might be a little delay. Then the graph refreshed itself automatically, but it had gone all wonky. One of the examiners chuckled, not unkindly. It was the timeless fate of all demos to go awry at moments like this, and everyone in the room knew it. "What the?" Sophia exclaimed. "How'd that downspike get in there?" For the burn rate graph looked basically the same, except that at the very end of it, the plot suddenly shot straight down to a huge negative number, then just as quickly jumped up and resumed the former sawtooth pattern. "Just a bad data point, maybe. An outlier?" "Do me a favor, Sophia, and check the balance in the account," Solly said. "It's gonna be damn near zero," Sophia said. "I was expecting to exhaust the funds this morning, but I've been too distracted to check." She turned her attention to the hole-in-the-wall account status window and navigated to the balance and billing screen. Featured prominently was a large number. "That's wrong," she said. "It's way too large." "Check recent activity," Solly suggested. She did so. A little spreadsheet came up. The most recent entry had been made 3 hours ago. Someone had made a deposit into the account. A very large deposit. 10 times as much as had been placed in the account back in February. It looks like your anonymous benefactor approves of your work, Solly said.
What do you think I should do?
Let it live, Solly said.